It's a year that promises to be etched in history, but not for the reasons you'd hope. The future isn't looking so rosy, from bombarded cities turned rubble to a preventable health crisis that is wiping us out like a modern plague. The crises aren't just global, they're personal. If that sounds bad, it gets worse. The numbers say you're more likely than ever to not see 2025 through, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So hold on tight for today's episode of The Infographic Show, why 2025 will be the worst year ever. Let's talk about you surviving 2025. Oh, you think it's going to be a breeze? Just another year to grind through while doom-scrolling social media and binging Netflix? Well, surprise, 2025 might have other plans. In case you haven't noticed, people are dying a lot more than usual. There have been excess deaths all over the world lately, including in the USA. It's a trend that didn't stop when the pandemic ended. In 2024, you could find lots of data from the EU, Australia, USA, and UK, showing us that excess mortality from 2020 to 2024 was well above the rate from 2015 to 2019. The US is one of the few countries in the world to experience life expectancy going in reverse. An NIH paper in 2022 said, men had a decline of 1.8 years from 76.3 years to 74.5 years. Women experienced a decline of 1.2 years from 81.4 years to 80.2 years. People are noticing that the US's life expectancy got worse during COVID-19 and then kept getting worse. While this trend is reversing in other countries around the world, the US seems committed to its new role as the Grim Reaper's favorite workplace. So, what's causing this? Well, there are multiple reasons. In 2024, historian Niall Ferguson controversially compared the U.S. deaths of despair rates to those in Russia during the Soviet Union collapse. This was a period of profound turmoil, where many Russians, particularly men, turned to vodka in staggering numbers. In the U.S., deaths of despair skyrocketed during and after the pandemic. In 2021 alone, over 209,000 people succumbed to them, about 6% of all deaths, a historic high. 2022 followed suit, and 2023 is looking no better, though the numbers are still provisional. For context, back in 1995, the number was just 65,000. It's a silent but consistent killer. Over the last decade, deaths of despair, including those linked to alcohol, have claimed more American lives than COVID-19. A report by the University of Chicago exposed a disturbing trend. At the pandemic's onset, deaths of despair surged by 10% to 60% compared to pre-pandemic levels, with working-class men aged 15 to 55 hit the hardest. This demographic is disproportionately affected. On average, American men die almost 6 years before U.S. females. In 2023, The Washington Post asked about this mental crisis in men with the headline, "Why aren't we paying attention?" It used to be that such deaths were mainly white working-class males, but there's been a large increase lately in black males dying this way. Native Americans and Alaskan Natives have always had very high rates. In general, the poor of all races, especially men, are dying from despair in terrifying numbers. You'll understand as we go along why they keep dying at these rates into 2025. From 2001 to 2021, the rate of self-harm fatalities in the U.S. rose by an alarming 31%. By 2022, the numbers reached over 39,200 men and nearly 10,200 women, the highest rate since 1941, according to the CDC. Equally alarming is that 1.6 million Americans attempted but survived, with men tragically succeeding far more often than women. While girls and women may be less likely to take that final step, the surge in self-harm among them is deeply alarming. A study revealed that emergency room admissions for self-harm among 10 to 14-year-old girls rose dramatically from 2009 to 2022. These increased rates, which were also seen in England, Scotland, and Australia, paint a chilling picture of a growing mental health crisis among young women. The question of why more men are choosing death over life and why more women are engaging in self-harm is complex. When it comes to men, experts point to what they call a crisis of masculinity, a phenomenon particularly impacting young Western males. This crisis, marked by feelings of purposelessness and isolation, is expected to worsen as we move into 2025. In 2023, The New Yorker described men as floundering at school and in the workplace. This aligns with the growing concerns in the media about males grappling with self-esteem issues and societal expectations. The topic has ignited heated debates on internet forums, where many argue that masculinity has been under siege in recent years particularly through portrayals in the media, TV, and movies. This isn't just anecdotal. A 2021 study analyzing U.S. sitcoms from 1980 to 2017 found that portrayals of incompetent dads skyrocketed from 18% in the 1980s to 56% in the 2010s. So the crisis of masculinity will still be with us in 2025, as will girls self-harming in record numbers. In 2024, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy called for social media platforms to carry warnings similar to those on cigarette packs, citing their role in fueling a dramatic spike in anxiety and depression among the youth. For many young females, feelings of inadequacy triggered by curated online perfection have led to self-harming behaviors. So it's not just males suffering from self-esteem issues, girls are hurting too. And in 2025, it's likely to be more of the same or even worse thanks to the toxic atmosphere online. Mental health in the young and old and the middle-aged is really bad right now, and it isn't suddenly going to get better. The U.S. is in the fourth wave of an opioid crisis, the first being when politicians and federal agencies didn't do enough to stop Big Pharma over-prescribing opioid drugs to Americans. The second wave was when the new addicts went into the streets to buy heroin, and the third was when synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, came to town. The fourth was when traffickers and dealers started adding fentanyl to counterfeit pills or batches of cocaine or methamphetamine. The bad news is the traffickers have lately become very good at making these deadly synthetics, and worse, they will get even better. The fourth wave will hurt in 2025. The scale of America's overdose crisis has grown over the decades. In the 1970s, during Nixon's war on drugs, overdose deaths ranged between 3,000 and 7,000 annually. By the 1980s, even with powerful anti-drug campaigns like the iconic "This is your brain on drugs" ads, the toll hovered between 2,500 and 5,000 per year. Now, fast forward to 2023, over 107,500 lives were lost to overdoses, following 111,000 deaths in 2022. That is a staggering leap. The numbers for 2024 are still unknown, but even if they're slightly improved, they're still nowhere near the rate seen in the late 20th century. The war on drugs is clearly a failure, but we haven't figured out a better way to deal with drugs, so 2025 might be better in terms of drug deaths, but it isn't going to see America's drug death problem disappear. Another reason for mental health issues, according to the studies, is political polarization. Americans are more divided than ever. Debate is healthy in a democracy, but it's not good for society to be this polarized. A Pew Research survey said 65% of Americans feel, quote, exhausted and 55% angry when talking about politics. In another survey, 87% said they feel exhausted over the division. This is being called toxic polarization, and it's hurting people in more ways than they probably know. A 2023 study by researchers at the University of Rochester used machine learning AI to look at 1.8 million headlines from mainstream media, and they said there is growing media bias, which is creating profound polarization. We observed a lot of subtle differences in the words they choose when they cover the same high-level topics. Americans might not realize it, but this shapes what they think of the issue or the person being discussed. Stanford University said, "The presentation is subtle and unaware to the untrained eye, so that even slight differences in the presentation can help change contextual understanding." But you're not fooled easily. You're capable of forming your own opinions on your own, right? Well, in 2025 and beyond, people, especially the young, might be getting worse at analyzing stories for bias, and unfortunately, the way things look, the bias is here to stay. Years ago, the news media had to rethink this strategy after social media profoundly diminished its ad revenue. Part of the new strategy is to make its partisan audience angry. Academics at Boston University explained, partisans tend to view each other negatively because polarized media weaponizes the differences between political and social groups instead of emphasizing commonalities. With this comes trust issues. Americans, say Gallup, are experiencing an all-time low in their trust of corporate media. Gallup explained, Americans continue to register record low trust in the mass media, with only 31% expressing a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in the media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. In 2023, half of Americans believe their national news organizations intentionally mislead, misinform, or persuade the public to adopt certain viewpoints. This deepening distrust is only one symptom of a broader crisis. Academics warn that political polarization, social fragmentation, and a loss of faith in institutions like the media and government are the hallmark signs of a nation in serious trouble. Add to that widening wealth inequality, and the cracks in the foundation become even clearer. And then there's military overreach, something we'll explore later. Of course, people have a right to not trust the media implicitly. The media is biased, and you can find many studies explaining how. That's always been the case in every nation, and to some extent, the public accepts it. But bias is worse than ever. This will have serious consequences. A media watchdog group in 2023 wrote, "If people cannot rely on outlets to report accurate or balanced news, they may become swayed by misinformation or fake news. Something will break if there aren't any changes in how we trust the people who lead us and the organizations that report the news to us." The average American trusts the government much less these days, regardless of who is in power. Pew Research wrote in April 2024 that only 22% of Americans say that they trust the government in Washington to do what's right. The level of trust took a dip in the mid-90s, but it stayed very low since about 2008. Even so, it's presently even lower now than it was in the late 70s. And that was after the Watergate scandal and lies about military actions in Southeast Asia. Importantly, trust in the government eventually returned after that, and it can surely come back again. The solution might lie in strengthening society's ability to resist manipulation by false or misleading information. But here's the troubling part. Research suggests your brain might actually be getting weaker. That's what recent studies tell us. They call this the reverse Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is a sustained increase in a society's intelligence, which is no longer happening for the first time in decades in this brave new digital world. Even with modern education, plentiful food, less backbreaking work, and information at our fingertips, we are getting dumber. The UK and some other countries have also seen a decline. The cause of this gradual dumbing down is not fully understood yet, but some armchair philosophers have pointed out that spending all day watching TikTok videos of people falling off of chairs, crushing it, or popping pimples probably isn't doing anyone's IQ any favors. Gallup said Americans are reading fewer books than ever. Pew Research said in 2021 that 23% of Americans said they hadn't read one book the year they were asked the question, and that includes audiobooks. In-depth research on the topic by the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt provides ample evidence that this dumbing down of society is really happening. It's actually rewiring our brains, creating more polarization, anxiety, depression, ignorance, and other serious issues regarding the way people live. He recently said in a podcast, we are possibly heading for civilizational collapse. All right, before we dive into what might be the biggest danger looming in 2025, let's tackle something light and uncontroversial: war. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that humanity loves to upsize its problems. Recent years have been marked by death, destruction, and a global playlist of conflicts stuck on repeat. But before you queue up our episode on what really happens if you dodge the army draft, don't panic just yet. There is still a faint glimmer of hope for diplomacy in 2025. Of course, political scientist John Mearsheimer has already taken a pin to that balloon, pointing out that relations between the U.S., its allies, and rival nations are likely to remain volatile and tense. China is poised to remain the biggest challenge to the U.S.'s unipolar status as the world's sole superpower. To counter this, the U.S. will likely intensify its economic efforts to weaken China, particularly through the ongoing trade war. But will this escalating rivalry lead to actual war in 2025? Experts suggest it's highly unlikely, for now. The real battleground may remain economic and technological supremacy rather than military conflict. But here's the bad news: World War III has already started. That's the view of the Washington Post foreign affairs writer George F. Will. The new axis, he said, is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And given the U.S. support for Israel, that could put Iran and the U.S. on the fast track to war. Open Democracy said it loud and clear. There is now no doubt that the U.S. is preparing for war with Iran. So here we have the makings of World War III, a new axis against the West. Will there ever be peace on Earth? It's unlikely anytime soon. Certainly not 2025. A political realist theory is that there is anarchy in the international system since there is no rule everyone follows. States will always try to accumulate more power because they think the other is doing the same. There's no global referee, so no trust. Mearsheimer calls this the tragedy of great power politics. If it's true, then this might mean more conflict at some point soon. You also have the $2.4 trillion, or $1 trillion in the U.S., spent on national security in all nations, which is a major part of the economies. It needs to keep ticking over. To put it another way, while a world war might not be penciled into 2025 on the calendar, don't go feeling too safe yet. Détente and diplomacy would be fantastic, sure, but it feels more like the world is preheating the oven for conflict. And if you think we're being dramatic, 22% of Americans agree, predicting World War III will happen within the next decade. Meanwhile, across the pond, the British, ever the enthusiasts for doom, take it up a notch, with 53% in a YouGov survey saying the world is about to kick off big time within 5 to 10 years. So much for the stiff upper lip. Believe it or not, your biggest enemy in 2025 is not war, but what you put into your body. Before we talk about that, let's say something about love, or a lack thereof. We all need love in our lives and for our mental well-being. Love making is also an important aspect of our existence. Sex releases endorphins and other happy chemicals into your brain. It's been humanity's go-to antidepressant for millions of years. It even helps with heart disease. So here is the million-dollar question: why are we stopping? Gen Z, we're looking directly at you. The loneliest generation in recorded history. That's right, the paradox is real. The most connected generation is the loneliest. Maybe all that scrolling isn't as stimulating as it feels. Researchers around the globe agree that Gen Z is having fewer partners and less sex than young people from any previous generation. And it doesn't look like this trend is about to reverse. To put it simply, the deeper we dive into technology and the more polarized society becomes, the less we're, well, diving into each other. The digital age is great for memes, but terrible for mating. In 2024, the American Survey Center said in its survey, nearly half of young men were not dating. The article said teenage dating was a rapidly disappearing part of the American teenage experience that was likely having a very negative effect on young men's mental health. Young men are the worst hit. This leaves a lot of young men feeling lonely, possibly playing video games or watching pornography. That's not us talking, it's research. In the 1990s, most males had lost their virginity by the time they left school. Now it's just 40%. A survey undertaken by the Survey Center on American Life explained just 56% of Gen Z adults had gone through their teen years with a romantic relationship, while 78% of bed-breaking boomers had at least one romantic relationship, and 76% of Gen Xers. Gen Z young women are also dating less. Back in 2021, a study in California said 38% of both males and females aged 18 to 30 had no sexual partners in the prior year, which was a decade high. In 2011, the rate was 22%. Any way you look at it, young folks are dating less and having less sex, and it's negatively affecting their mental health. Will this improve in 2025? No, it'll get worse as people become more polarized and become more immersed in technology. This has led to what experts call a loneliness epidemic. Shockingly, in the UK, with a population of just 69 million, 1.9 million young people are reported as being chronically lonely. A report in the US said it was worse in 15 to 24-year-old people who had 70% fewer social interactions with their friends than people their age in the past. The report also talked about how loneliness can lead to diseases, such as heart disease, and also premature death. We'll show you soon how premature death is becoming a major concern in American society. But don't worry, by 2025, your friendly neighborhood tech company will have the perfect solution for your loneliness: AI. Why not let an AI version of you date an AI version of someone else and just send you the highlights reel? It's like outsourcing heartbreak. Congratulations, Black Mirror isn't just a show anymore, it's a business model. This will only make you lonelier. Zeros and ones are no replacement for flesh and blood. We even asked ChatGPT what it thought about this, and it confessed AI cannot replace the complexity and richness of human connection. Yep, we just used an AI to throw shade at AI. Possibly the same traitor that will one day replace all of us writers. Don't laugh, it's coming for yours too. 2025 will be the year robots will not just be in your office, they'll be running it. The World Economic Forum has predicted AI will take 85 million jobs by 2025. It says just as many jobs will be created as time goes on, but it will take time for all those new jobs to be developed. The Guardian in 2024, citing research from the Institute for Public Policy Research, said AI apocalypse could take away almost 8 million jobs in the UK. Keyword could. So many workers might not be eliminated, but right now the UK, US, and Australia are seeing disruption in the workplace. Globally, the IMF in 2024 said AI will affect 40% of jobs and likely worsen inequality. It's doubtful companies will unnecessarily invent jobs for people now surplus to requirements. Let's now talk about your biggest threat: health. A peer-reviewed article in the British Medical Journal revealed some scary findings. They'd analyzed mortality rates from Our World in Data, a research website run out of Oxford University. Scientists analyzed excess deaths, the number of people who died beyond what would typically be expected, from January 1, 2020 to December 31, 2022. Across 47 countries in the Western world, they identified more than 3 million excess deaths. What is especially troubling is how consistent these numbers were year after year. Approximately 1 million in 2020, 1.2 million in 2021, and 800,000 in 2022. They noted that excess mortality has remained high in the Western world for 3 consecutive years, despite the implementation of containment measures and COVID-19 vaccines. They felt that this raises serious concerns and governments need to investigate it. We keep dying at high rates. It's a trend that looks to continue that we haven't figured out. The data shows that in the US, UK, much of Europe, and Australia, we've been seeing worrying excess deaths into 2024. The answer to this puzzle is complicated, but there is more. We've also been getting sicker at a younger age for many years. The incidences of young people dying from cancer have increased, with the BBC citing a study that said the global incidence of early-onset cancer has increased by 79% between 1990 and 2019, with the number of cancer-related deaths in younger people rising by 29%. The article called it a worrying puzzle. It got even worse after 2019. ABC News wrote in 2024, experts still aren't sure why certain cancer rates are increasing in younger adults, but say it could be due to rising rates of obesity and still unknown environmental factors. Take a moment to consider your own health. Obesity is a growing crisis. The World Health Organization reports that 1 in 8 people worldwide is affected. In the US, the CDC estimates that 40% of all adults and 1 in 5 children are obese, with these numbers climbing steadily. Without significant government intervention, the problem is set to worsen. By 2030, half of US adults are projected to be obese, with rates exceeding 60% in some poorer states. Looking further ahead, a 2023 Lancet study predicts that by 2050, 2 in 3 American adults, 1 in 3 teens, and 1 in 5 children will be obese. These trends pose serious health and economic challenges for future generations. A major factor is your food is making you sick. Harvard Public Health said ultra-processed food, or UFC, is to blame for much of the sickness and premature death. Unfortunately, various research says 60 to 90% of the standard American diet is made up of these foods. In the UK, data shows UFCs make up 57% of calories consumed by the average adult and 65% of the average kid's diet. The poor and working class are the most affected. The research is clear. According to a paper in the British Medical Journal, ultra-processed food is associated with at least 32 diseases, including heart disease, cancer, lung conditions, mental health disorders, and many other negative health outcomes, including dying young. We are slowly poisoning ourselves, and it is costing us dearly. From 2011 to 2020, nutrition-related chronic diseases racked up an astonishing $16 trillion in costs in the U.S. Meanwhile, big food and pharmaceutical companies are thriving. Simply put, eating junk and getting sick has become a highly lucrative business, and it's you that's paying the price. Over half of all Americans take prescription drugs daily, often for problems caused by their diets. Americans born recently can expect to be taking medications for half of their entire lives. Right now, we take more drugs than ever, with 70% of Americans taking at least 1 prescription medication per day. 9 years ago, it was 60%. 1 in 6 Americans takes a psychiatric drug for conditions, the less serious ones that experts say could be vastly improved with a better diet and improved lifestyle. Meanwhile, the CDC says the rates of diagnosed diabetes among the U.S. population went from just under 1% in 1958 to around 6% in 2000, to 7% in 2014, and around 11% in 2021. It's expected to reach approximately 14% by 2023. The rate is expected to increase again by 2050. Globally, 529 million people lived with diabetes in 2021, and is expected to reach 1.3 billion by 2050. Surely, if we know this, we can do something about it. The solution seems simple: eat better. Easy, right? Except that for many, it's easier said than done. Healthy food often comes with a premium price tag, and the ongoing global cost of living crisis is not helping. In 2023, 3 out of 4 consumers worldwide worried about rising costs. While the crisis will eventually pass, there's still no clear end in sight. In the UK, recent research shows that people in the poorest areas are now living shorter lives than they did just 20 years ago. Across the Atlantic, the situation is equally stark. In the US, the wealthiest Americans live on average 15 years longer than the poorest. Even more concerning, the average American's chances of living a long, healthy life are comparable to those of someone born in Blackpool, a UK seaside town at the bottom of life expectancy rankings, long plagued by illegal drugs, cheap processed food, and alcohol. So, if we can compare that life expectancy to the average American, we can say health outcomes in the US are simply atrocious. Junk food is killing us. Unfortunately, our brains are evolutionarily hardwired to gorge on fats, sugars, and salts, so to get away from this ultra-processed nightmare will take government intervention. But it seems like there is little appetite for research that's good for people and their well-being. You could argue that it's the most important issue on the planet for the next year. If we can avoid war, another pandemic, or even an environmental disaster, even if there's a change in how food, agriculture, or even pharmaceuticals are regulated, it will still be a few years until Americans get healthier. As things stand, we are getting sicker, sadder, fatter, angrier, more divided, and lonelier. This could change, but unfortunately, it won't happen overnight. Think 2025 will be the worst year ever? Or is the real chaos just getting started? Drop your predictions. Robot overlords, world wars, or something worse. And if you're optimistic, tell us what planet you're escaping to. Now go check out how to actually survive World War III, or click on this video instead.